Shifting from right to left. Play action to that side. Rolling right, looking. Fires in the end zone. Gonna be caught. Touchdown. That's a tight end from 15 yards out.
Welcome to the Bowl Season Stories Podcast, Season 3, Episode 20. I'm Nick Carparelli, the Executive Director of Bowl Season, and today we are joined by Senior Columnist and Editor-in-Chief for College Football at The Athletic, Stewart Mandel. If you missed any of our previous episodes, you can catch them on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to your podcasts. And if you enjoyed today's show, we'd appreciate you to like, subscribe, and drop a 5-star rating. And as always, you can follow all the bowl season news on our website, bowlseason.com, and on social media at Bowl Season. Today's show is brought to you by Sport Radar, reimagining immersive experiences for sports fans and bettors. Our first guest is a senior columnist and editor-in-chief for college football at The Athletic, and is also the co-host of the Audible podcast. He has over 25 years of professional experience, having also worked for Sports Illustrated and Fox Sports. Please welcome to the show, Stewart Mandel. Stewart, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
So this is our final podcast of the 2023-24 season. It's year 3. So this is my 61st podcast, Stewart. Now, I am not a trained media professional, but I play the role as host. Typically, that is what you're trained at. You interview people. You've interviewed me many times. I don't interview people as a profession. I get interviewed. So it's a little role reversal here. So we'll start out with a few questions. I'll ask you these questions, but I think it'd be fun for us in the middle of this to take a little time and maybe talk about some of the challenges that are facing college football in general that are impacting bowl season, and we could have a little dialogue back and forth, and we'll see if Nick and Stewart can solve all of college football's problems.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's an easy fix, so I'm sure we can get to it in 10 minutes.
We'll get that done. No one else has been thinking about it.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to kick it off with the obvious. College football playoff is all wrapped up. We have a national championship champion. Great game last night. Michigan Wolverines was a fun game to watch. What are some of your thoughts on this year's playoff? And also talk to us about what are you looking forward to next season with the new 12-team playoffs kicking off?
Well, it was a little bit mixed emotions because on the one hand, I really, really vehemently disagreed with the decision to leave Florida State out. I think that this is a sport where if you go 13-0 in a major conference, you should be rewarded. And I wasn't comfortable with the committee trying to predict how they would play without their quarterback. Now, the flip side of that is we had 2 amazing semifinals, right? And I don't, it may well be that if Florida State had tried to play that game, we saw how good Michigan completely shut down Michael Penix. That probably would not have, foretold good things for Florida State's backup quarterback. So the, hurt and disappointment for Florida State gave way to 2 fantastic semifinals. And really, in 10 years of this system, that was the best semifinal doubleheader we've had.
Yeah, by far. So you think, obviously the issues with Florida State, if this was next year, it wouldn't have been an issue. They would have been in the playoff. People would have debated, should they have played in those opening round games or should they have been able to get a bye? But at least they would have been in. It would have been a different dynamic for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we go to the new system, you have a security blanket so for a situation like that where the team's not going to get left out completely, but then the debate will just shift to where they should be seated or where another team in that situation should be seated. I mean, we'll see what it's like once it gets going. I think one thing people haven't maybe necessarily fully accounted for is because they're reserving spots for those champions and because we're going to go to 4 major conferences instead of 5, you could have situations where a team is ranked 10th in the final poll, but they won the ACC, so they're the number 3 seed or the number 4 seed in the playoff and getting to take a bye, whereas the number 5 team is playing in the first round. It would have been, I think Florida State would have gotten one of those top 4 by default, right? Because they'd be one of the 4 power conference champions. But, I would say that the team that probably if you were a team that drew them in the playoffs, you'd be feeling better about drawing that team with the backup quarterback than maybe a lower ranked team that's at full strength.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, you know as well as I do, college football unfortunately has been very reactionary over the years. So if something quirky happens in these first 2 years, do they tweak that format a little bit? Probably. If you and I were going to predict, we'd probably say that's likely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, keep in mind that they did the proposal that it ended up, coming to life was enacted or was written before all the conference shuffling. I mean, that was
Right.
right what became so contentious. People were upset that Greg Sankey was part of that committee, and then as soon as they announced it, or about a month after they announced it, he made the first move of many dominoes. So I think they are going to have to make some adjustments because it was conceived for a different version of college football. We can get into that more later, but I mean, it was pre-NIL, it was early transfer portal, immediate eligibility. A lot has changed since that format was first introduced, but that's the one they're going to market with.
Well, let's talk about bowls for a minute. You've been a college football writer for 2 decades and have been to dozens of bowl games, playoff games, other games, bowl games that have had emerging programs, have great experiences, and then games that were duds as well. What are some of your best bowl season memories over the years?
Well, I've told this story a million times, but really the formative experience for me that turned me into, a college football, sold me on college football for life and led to me getting into this profession is that I was a sophomore at Northwestern when in 1995, when they came out of absolute nowhere to win the Big Ten and go to the Rose Bowl for the first time in 47 years. And this was, pre BCS when there was no higher goal, right, for a Big Ten team than to go to the Rose Bowl. So it was a huge deal. And getting out there, also, I had never been to California. I'm from Cincinnati, and getting out there, it's probably a couple days before New Year's, and it's sunny and warm, and there's palm trees. And then you walk into, the experience of walking into that stadium for the first time and seeing the painted end zones. I mean, it was heaven. It really was. And I feel like everything I've done since then all started. I mean, that whole season was amazing, but really experiencing the Rose Bowl firsthand, really when it was at its peak, was an absolute formative experience. Since then, in my professional career, I mean, that's the game I've covered the most by far. And I will always have an affinity for the 2:15 p.m. Pacific kickoff and the sunset and all of that, even though its place in the system is changing. I think obviously the bowl season has changed dramatically since when I was, first coming up in the business. One thing that's changed a lot, because I do our bowl projections, as you know, it's
I know for sure.
impossible.
I watch them.
Yeah, it's
You're more
absolutely.
accurate than most, Stewart, by the way.
Well, I'm more accurate than most because we actually make some calls.
Yeah.
We don't just guess, but even then, I mean, I made a lot of calls the week leading into the championship weekend, and then Florida State gets left out, and the whole thing, what the bowl directors thought was going to happen didn't happen. So
Did you pick Northwestern to be going to the Las Vegas Bowl?
I think no, because I'm trying to. It's hard to rethink all. At that point, we thought Maryland was going, but then Maryland moved up. There was that whole domino effect. But what I was going to say is, I have some nostalgia for the days when, the bowl scouts would show up at the stadiums, and the beat writers, like a lot of my intel back then would be the beat writers of the teams actually wrote stories about where's it looking like they're going to go, and they'd have quotes from the bowl scouts. And I think everybody's pretty much just given up at this point. They're just going to end up wherever they get slotted. So that's kind of my, where I am kind of in my AI. It's funny, at the Rose Bowl, I was talking to some slightly older writers who were reminiscing about the days when the bowl matchups would get brokered in like late October. And and that was a big deal to try to find out, like, who's the Fiesta Bowl, who are they making a deal with and whatnot. Maybe part of me is like, hey, let's just go back to that. Let's have you want, as long as we're going to be mixing and matching the teams the way we do, let's just do that.
Well, I'll tell you this, as we talk about solutions to how we fix college football, how we fix some of the problems that are impacting the bowl system and make the bowl system more exciting. I don't want to jump ahead of ourselves here, but That might not be a bad idea. You slot the 12 teams and the rest, maybe it's a little bit more of an open system instead of these
Yeah.
locked in spots that sometimes create mismatches. So you have the next two teams that are excited to play, and maybe they had breakout seasons and aren't necessarily disappointed that they're not in the playoff. I think that could help the system a little bit, but we could talk about that in a little bit. Now, you wrote back in 2007, you wrote the book Bowls, Polls, and Tattered Souls. Great name. Tackling the chaos and controversy over college football back in 2007. Now, I was working, we knew each other then. I was working at the Big East Conference for Mike Tranghese. We were coordinating the BCS at the time. That was pre-Bill Hancock as an employee. And the commissioners were taking a rotation to run it. And I was Mike's number two. Crazy to think that's how it worked. But the chaos and controversy over college football, I think relatively speaking in 2007, the chaos and controversy was mild compared to today. In some ways, we've endured a lot of change in college football in the last decade and a half. If you were to make a volume 2, what would some of the topics you'd choose to write about be?
Well, I mean, it's funny you say that because I think the chaos and controversy over the BCS was much more nasty than has been over the CFP. I mean, you had situations where, Auburn goes 13-0, but there's only 2 spots for 3 undefeated teams, or the year that Texas beat Oklahoma, but then the tiebreaker caused Oklahoma to get in. Like, that system, by the end, and people just hate it. I mean, Dan Wetzel wrote that book, Death to the BCS. So people get upset about some CFP controversies, but not to the extent we were holding congressional hearings. Like the BCS gave the late Chris Dufresne wrote at one point, like it was a perfectly imperfect system. And because it gave us so much fodder as sports writers. But you're right that other layers of the sport are now kind of more in the crosshairs. And I think, as I think back, there was a chapter in there about realignment that seems so quaint now. Like, obviously the Big East was one of the most directly affected at the time. But, the chapter was called How Boston College and Clemson Became Neighbors. The idea being, like, at that time, it just seemed absolutely absurd that a team from the Northeast was in a conference with a team from the Southeast. And here we are all these years later, and we've just blown so far past that.
Well, personally, I still think it's absurd, to be honest with you, but that's my opinion. It's personal to me. I lived that, but
it's I mean, in an ideal world, the Big East would still be thriving. The Northeast would have its own conference. The West Coast would have its own conference. And it just, and I haven't picked up that book in a long time, but if I were, I bet the dollar figures that are mentioned in there in terms of like why those schools left for the ACC would just seem so puny compared to the $1 billion deals we're talking about now. I think that, I mean, obviously we've had transfer portal loosening and NIL and all that, but realignment has really changed this sport the most drastically of anything. And we're only about to really see the full effect of that.
Well, let's dive into some of the newer issues of the day, right? That we didn't have back then. We didn't have 3 years ago. The opt-outs, the transfer portal, the early signing period, the NIL. I've been asked a lot, Stuart, in the past couple of weeks about how to fix the bowl system, and my answer has been pretty consistent. And I'm confident that I'm accurate in saying that bowl games and the bowl system are not the problem. The bowls themselves don't necessarily need to be fixed. It needs to continue to evolve like everything else in college athletics. The problems are the unregulated circumstances that have been allowed to happen around them that are really affecting the entire sport in not too many positive ways, I don't think. And I mentioned the early signing period, the mid-year transfer portal window, NIL. Let's talk about some of those. You want to pick one first?
Well, I mean, I think
let's talk about some solutions to it. Like how do we fix these problems?
Well, I keep getting asked the same thing about that crunch of everything happening at once in December. And, there's not an easy solution. The easiest part is early signing day. I mean, personally, just this past week, we've seen some huge commitment announcements for next year's class. kids are verbally committing to LSU and whatnot. If you want to have a truly early signing period, it should be before their senior season of high school. I also think that would help, because a lot of high school players are getting squeezed out because schools are saving so many scholarships for the portal. If that got locked in earlier than it did, so that would take one thing off the coaches' plates, but it's really not the thing that's taking up their time. It's the portal, and I don't have an easy answer for that because it's the academic calendar. Kids that are going to a new school want to be enrolled for January semester so they can participate in spring practice. So if people have said, oh, you should just wait until after the bowls to open the portal, well, that doesn't give you a lot of time to pick your new school and be enrolled in time for January, 14th or whenever classes start. So I don't have a solution for that. I do think, and I think you've said it and others too, let's acknowledge the importance of NIL and let's stop beating around the bush about it. And to me, if you're going to have the All-State Sugar Bowl, there's no reason why All-State can't make some NIL deals with some of the star players to, help make them feel better about the decision to play and not opt out. I don't know that you're going to prevent, the guys who are determined to go in the portal and go to their next school are going to do that. But some of these guys who are, about to be drafted and are deciding, should I take the injury risk and play in the game or not, which frankly, I don't know how high that injury risk really is, or to the injury risk that would affect your draft stock. I think a logical step would be to integrate some of those sponsors into the NIL world and some of the events surrounding the game.
Good thoughts, Stewart. You kind of touched on all the issues a little bit. I'll do the same, and then maybe we can focus on them one at a time a little bit. I think in general, if you look at the NFL, and obviously NFL is different than college. NFL can do whatever they want. There's not a lot of restrictions on the calendar other than holidays and whatnot. They've made the year a calendar of events, right? And a good calendar is a sequence of events, not a piling up of events all at one time, right? So you think about the NFL, you got preseason, regular season, postseason, combine, draft, free agency, schedule release. I might have a couple of those out of order, but it's a nice sequence. As I alluded to, college football doesn't have that. Why can't we try to have something similar where you have, preseason, regular season, postseason, let it run its course, right? Get rid of that early signing period, right? Maybe move it earlier, like you said. I think the old way was not a bad way. It wasn't the worst, having one signing period that first Wednesday in February. It was kind of a holiday for college football in a way, and I think that'd be a way to generate excitement at that time of year. We created that early signing period because it made sense without all those other issues piled on top of it, but now it doesn't make sense. So I'd like to see that. Allow spring practice to have the high school recruiting period and signing day in February, spring practice, one transfer portal window, the end of the academic year in May. I think that would be a big help. And I know you said it, semester ends, there's 2 semesters in college. I think if it is at all important for student athletes to graduate, having them commit to 1 full year academically is not a bad idea. I know people are afraid to say, well, you can't do something or you can't play the following year. And you don't have to do that. You don't have to sit out a year. If you're going to make a commitment to academically to an institution, it's for 1 full academic year. And if something happens where you don't go to school that second half of the year, well, you just can't go somewhere else, right? I think a lot of that December transfer portal window for coaches is get them in the spring, let's get going. But if we could say, all right, there's a commitment, and there's nothing wrong with holding people accountable to a commitment. I don't know about you, Stuart, but I get paid to do my job. If I don't do my job, I don't get paid. So let's think about having 1 transfer portal window period in May. What do you think about that?
I think in a vacuum, it would make perfect sense, right? Because of exactly what you said earlier. The NFL, to me, has always been geniuses at how can we keep ourselves in the news 365 days a year, right? There's no time of year where there isn't something going on in the NFL. But, I think the problem is right now is that, the courts have spoken, and all signs lead, it's hard at this point to put the genie back in the bottle. I think the NCAA in general, the climate is to loosen restrictions. We've seen, now we don't have a 25 scholarship limit per class. And, I mean, it's crazy that it happened this way, but, you had a group of attorney generals basically get the second time transfer thing lifted, at least temporarily. So it'd be one thing if we were doing this from scratch, but to say you've had the ability to transfer freely, now we're taking that away, seems to me to be the cause for the next lawsuit or the next politician to get involved. I also think that, the players would still transfer, right? Like you said, you can put a rule in that says you can't participate in practice at your new school until the fall, but I think the athletes would still go ahead and get to their next campus.
Potentially.
So yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, it's not wrong, right? Like, it doesn't make sense. I mean, Ohio State's starting quarterback entered the portal, 2 days after the Michigan game. By the time the bowl game came around, he'd been gone for a month. And the other thing I would say is I think for years we put restrictions on the athletes that we didn't have on the coaches. And so that's another tough one, would be this: why are you guys saying an athlete can't do that? An athlete has to wait till the end of the season, but a coach can still change jobs, the morning after Thanksgiving or the Sunday morning after the last games. I think on, that precedent. I mean, you can remember, Nick, when coaches would get a new job but stay with the team through the bowl game, and that, nobody does that anymore, in large part because of the calendar, because of the recruiting calendar and the portal calendar. So it's a great idea in a vacuum. I don't know if it's practical.
I do think you make a great point. Coaches have always been able to do what they want. But people often leave out the fact that they do what they want with ramifications, right? There's often, almost always, big buyouts in these cases. The student athlete now, talk about the pendulum swinging, right? Now they can do whatever they want with no ramifications, right?
Right.
So that's where I think too, and I think that's where Charlie Baker's biggest challenge is how do you have a system where you have all these new rules, but people are held accountable. You can't have, this is happening in every sport, you can't have unrestricted free agency, all year long. Sure, the transfer portal window's twice, but you can, people make their decision before that. I think there's got to be some accountability in the system, some penalty, if you will. Like I said earlier, if you sign an agreement, you're obligated to fulfill it. If you don't fulfill it, then you don't get paid what you were, promised to get paid.
Well, there's one definite way to make that happen, and that's if they become employees, and that's a whole other can of worms. And I personally think we're heading that way, whether it's a year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, just because the legal climate, and then and that sets off a whole other set of headaches, obviously. But one thing it would do is you could then sign a player to a contract and it says you are, locked in here for a year or 2 years or 3, whatever it is. And if you break that contract, like you said, there's going to be ramifications.
Well, that leads into the player compensation. You talked about that, whether it's through NIL or a more formal method. I think obviously finances plays a big part in student athletes' decisions. I'm wondering if, that we saw 2 years ago when, it was last season, Alabama played Kansas State in the Sugar Bowl. It was not a playoff game. Every single player on the Alabama roster participated. And I'm told that the university took out insurance policies for these players and said, look, we need you to play, but we have you covered. Again, I don't know if anything's going to solve all the problems, but that's something I'm going to talk about privately and publicly. The notion of, should there be economies of scale, a blanket insurance policy for all of bowl season? including the playoffs. That might make sense, and be something good for a lot of people.
Especially if we're going to the expanded playoff. I mean, the thing that we don't know yet if it'll happen, but I think it personally will, is guys opting out of the playoff, because the agents are going to tell them you can't play another 3 or 4 games. That's too big a risk.
I agree with you on that.
Maybe they might opt out mid playoff. They might play, the quarters and the first round and the quarters, and then it gets to, because also at some point they got to start preparing for the combine. I think, you mentioned off the top, right? Like the reactionary, I think one of the first reactions is going to be, oh crap, we can't have this thing run all the way till January 20th. That's, the NFL deadline is you're coming up on that. The combine is not that far away at that point. I think they're going to have to shift the entire calendar of the sport earlier and have the playoff end around when it does now. Otherwise, yes, you might, if you're let's say a projected 2nd round pick. I'm not talking like, Caleb Williams here, 2nd, 3rd round guy, but you're entering the draft. The combine is going to, and the senior, now juniors are eligible for the Senior Bowl. Like, you got to go do those things. And I don't know that it's realistic to say, well, come on, you're playing the national championship. You got to stay. The same financial decisions that are behind opting out of the ReliaQuest Bowl are going to start applying to the playoff. And I don't know that that's something that was part of the thought process when they came up with the calendar that they did.
Yeah, I agree with you. And when you're talking 3 or 4 additional games at the end of the season that the new playoff is going to, provide, backups are going to say, well, I don't need to play right now. People may not focus on the backup opting out, but over 4 games, that backup's going to need to step in a lot of cases. So now you're going third string in a really important moment in a game. I don't know. It's just not going to be a good look.
It happened in this playoff. It didn't get a lot of attention, but Malik Murphy, Texas's number 2 quarterback, his team made the playoff and he entered the portal. It was his choice. He said that he felt like he needed to get a start on visiting other schools. So if Quinn Ewers got hurt in the Sugar Bowl, it was going to be true freshman Arch Manning coming in, and 5-star or not, it probably wasn't ready for that. So, but I don't think it's just backups. I think you got to worry about, take Georgia, for example. All of their guys played, other than I think Brock Bowers, all their guys played in the Orange Bowl, right?
And it showed.
Yeah, and it showed. But that was the end of their season on December 30th. Next year, Georgia makes the playoff, and let's be honest, Georgia's probably making it pretty far in the playoff. And suddenly those guys that were okay playing on December 30th now have to play January 9th, January 20th, whatever, like, I don't know. I think it's a problem. And I'm interested to see. I feel like the first 2 years of the playoff, which are the last 2 years of the current contract, become a bit of a trial balloon. It's, as we all know, right, you have to be unanimous to make changes and whatnot. 2026, everything's on the table. And
Right.
I would be surprised if there aren't changes to that format.
Yeah. Well, this has been good discussion. I obviously no easy solutions. I think there's going to come a point in time. You made the point a few times, Stewart, that things are hard and threat of litigation, whatever. I think at some point in time, the leadership in college football is gonna have to, gotta use my words right, gonna have to come up with a plan that's in the best interest of the sport and the best interest of the most people involved, and take a little bit of a chance in saying this is what we need to do, and not operate afraid. That's just my personal opinion. But
And that leads to the quick question: who is the leadership of college football? Right? Like, you mentioned my book, and I appreciate that. It's ancient history at this point. But one of the very first things in the book is the first thing you know about college football is that no one's in charge. And, ostensibly the commissioners run college football, but the commissioners have their own, their first interest, obviously their own conference. I mean, I think if you did have a Roger Goodell of college football, a lot of this stuff would be a lot easier to enact, but it's a system that doesn't do well with moving fast. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, let's move on. A few more questions. Regardless of what gets fixed and how it gets fixed, bowl season is here. It's not going anywhere. It's going to stay the same, or it's going to get better. But I make the case you can't deny the fact that college football needs more than 12 opportunities teams to play in the postseason, right? So it's year to year for some programs, but for many programs, the bowl game experience is really meaningful. The history is important. I think about the fact that there are 3 emerging programs that won their first bowl game ever this year. I think about a school like Rutgers that had to play in a division with Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State, scraped together 6 wins, beat Miami in the Pinstripe Bowl. And, I don't know if you watched that game, but you see the
I
reaction
did.
after yeah, I mean, you can't tell me that wasn't meaningful. Even a program like Clemson, who's been there before, right? They were 4-4, and people were writing them off, writing Coach Sweeney off. They win their last 4 games. They get to the Gator Bowl, beat an SEC team in Kentucky, get their 9th win for the 15th consecutive year. Really important for them, right? So talk about the role that the rest of the bowl games are going to continue to play in college football.
Yeah, they're always going to play a role because there's so many teams. I'll use my alma mater as a great example. I don't think any Northwestern fan is under the delusion that they're going to be a regular contender for the 12-team playoff. So then what is a quote unquote good season for Northwestern? Well, this year, after what, the last couple of years had been before that, going 7-5, getting to the Vegas Bowl and beating a very good Utah team was a hugely successful season for them, right? I just wish that game had been a little bit later. The December 23rd date made it hard for fans to go to it. I think if it were later, a lot more Northwestern fans would have attended. So, those are the schools I think about in terms of the importance of preserving bowl games. Northwestern, Purdue, Minnesota. I'm just throwing out random examples. Rutgers was a good one. These teams aren't going to the playoff. Maybe they will once in a blue moon, but they're not threatening to be regular playoff teams.
Well, and they're certainly never going to get there, Stewart, if they don't have the bowl system as building blocks, stepping stones to get there.
Right. So there needs to be a reward at the end of the season. Now, I also fully acknowledge that I think in the SEC in particular, it's going to become playoff or bust because every one of those teams, except maybe Vanderbilt, thinks they should be a regular national championship contender. And they're just going to, it's going to be either we made the playoff and it was a good season or we missed it and we stunk, right? And so it's going to be harder to motivate those or keep those teams and those fan bases motivated to be interested in a non-playoff bowl. But, I'm sure your industry would know much better than me kind of what they see the next iteration as. But I know there will always be a place for the bowls, for the kind of teams I'm talking about. The ones I worry about are the how do you call it, middle class, the bowls that have people. The Citrus Bowl has a huge long Peyton Manning played in it and all these great right, but they're almost like too high in the pecking order because the kind of teams they get are those teams that if things had gone a little differently in a couple games, they'd be in the playoff. And are those fans still going to want to travel to Orlando for a game like that? That's what we can't, fully predict right now.
Yeah, I guess my hope is that people will, stop thinking about what the bowl season and the bowl system was and just embrace what it is today and the role that it does play. I mean, we say that bowl season and the college football playoff are together make college football's postseason, right? And it's really a celebration of the sport every year in December, and that's what we need to keep it as.
I think there's 2 things I would embrace that have become noticeable here, especially this year. First of all, the Pop-Tarts Bowl, the Duke's Mayo Bowl, like these have become in a very short time like must-see TV.
They're fun, right, Stewart? I mean,
they're fun.
It's fun, yeah.
The fans love. People on social media get into it. I would have to think, I'm not an expert on this, that more people watch those games than would have if there wasn't an edible mascot. Yeah. So, that I would definitely embrace the fun. And then I would also just say, like, I know these are technically a culmination of the 2023 season, but in some ways they're also a glimpse of next season. We got to see several major programs, quarterbacks for next season we saw Jackson Arnold make his first start, Nico at Tennessee. Unfortunately Devin Brown got hurt, but that's what Miller Moth at USC goes out and throws 6 touchdowns and makes his case for next year. I think maybe, for the players, it's obviously a culmination of all their hard work. For the fans, maybe it becomes more of a sneak peek of what to expect next season.
I think you're right, for sure. Couple last questions for you. You've previously been a voter in the weekly college football AP top 25. Do you still do that or no? Is that something?
Oh no, that was a long time ago.
Yeah. You missed
I gave
that?
No, I gave it up pretty quickly. It's prestigious. Don't get me wrong. It was an honor to be included in it, but it's just such a mess to try to decipher, because college football, everything changes from the time you wake up and watch game day until the end of the late night game, the whole landscape changes in an instant, and you got to kind of reprocess that in a very short amount of time. I also think it's becoming harder and harder to do these rankings with bigger conferences, unbalanced schedules.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested to see, because to this point, the committee has not behaved all that differently than the pollsters in terms of ordering it by losses. Next year, the kind of schedule that Ole Miss is going to play, it's going to be harder than the kind of schedule a team in the ACC is going to play. It's just the reality. And I'm interested to see if the committee is going to start treating it that way, or if we're just going to kind of continue to default to 0 before 1, 1 before 2, 2 before 3.
Mm-hmm. Last question for you, kind of a 2-part question. From a writer's perspective, what makes the game of college football so compelling and so popular? And what are some of your hopes for the sport as we enter the off season?
It's all about those fall Saturdays. No other sport has a regular season that's as compelling and exciting, where, like I said, you wake up on Saturday morning thinking, there's just so many times that I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to be focused on this game, and this game. And then something completely different ends up being the game of the day, the biggest upset. I love, that, yes, so obviously the focus on the national championship, but it's also on Kansas resurrecting its program, and the rise of James Madison. There's all these other stories around the country that come up, and hopefully that is preserved and not, I just think the games are exciting. It's not like NFL Sundays, they're exciting too, don't get me wrong, but there's more scarcity in college football, and there's more teams, right? There's more possibilities of what's going to be the big event today. What do I hope going forward? I hope that the move to these super conferences doesn't kind of wipe away some of those things I just talked about, that doesn't make it so that there's only a dozen teams that anybody is interested in. You look at what's happened to Oregon State and Washington State. They don't deserve that. I hope that they can find a path going forward where their fans are still going to feel like they're part of the dance and not completely disenfranchised. So it's going to be a much different sport. There's no question about it. And it's obviously a very TV driven sport, but let's not forget about, people that go and I have many friends like this. They've been tailgating for 30 years and with the same people, and those 7 Saturdays in the fall are kind of, they build their whole year around it. And the experience of the actual college students. We saw the videos last night of the scene in Ann Arbor. Nothing better than being a college student at a school that's having success like that. So I hope we can, I fully acknowledge it's a big TV show now, but I hope we can acknowledge also what happens on the campus level every week, and what it does for school spirit and morale and all those good things.
Good thoughts there, Stewart. Well, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate your time. You do a great job covering the sport, Stewart. I really appreciate your perspective on things. I think you're usually fair, I appreciate your perspective on the bowl system and understanding its place in the world of college football moving forward. So thanks so much for joining us. Catch your breath at the end of this exciting college football season, and you and I will talk soon.
All right. Thanks so much, Nick.
All right, take care. TaxAct knows watching college football is fun. Doing your taxes? Not so much. That's why they make filing simple. So let's get them over with. TaxAct, the official tax filing software of bowl season. Go to taxact.com to get started today. Well, that'll do it for this week's podcast. If you missed any of our past episodes, you can catch them on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to your podcasts. And if you enjoyed today's show, we'd appreciate you to like, subscribe, and drop a 5-star rating. And as always, you could follow all the bowl season news on our website, bowlseason.com, and on social media at bowlseason. Thanks for listening.